share with us your thoughts on different kinds of inequality, in particular with respect to climate change. And I have in mind like three types: the inequality between people alive today and people in future generations not yet born, inequalities between individuals in rich countries and those in poor countries, and we've heard a little bit about that, and also inequalities within countries, and Southampton and New Orleans are examples of that. But if each of you would sort of speak to which of these is the most problematic for thinking through climate change related issues, let alone inequality issues, but the climate change relationship between inequality, I'd like to, that nexus is what we'd like you to address. And Nick, you in particular have written very forcefully about how there's no good ethical justification to value our generation more than future ones. So I'd like it if you could start us off on your thoughts with this.
I will, but all three kinds of inequality matter a lot for this question. So asking me to pick just one is a bit like saying, which of the 10 commandments should we drop first?
Well, I can tell you that, but...
Well, Joe will tell you over dinner, I think. But let me focus on the one that you highlighted, because the physics of climate change has made this just about as difficult as it could be. This is something that manifests itself with quite long lags. They can be decades. This is something that's full of uncertainty, and humans are not very good at thinking about uncertainty. There's some in the audience and one or two on the stage who are not bad, but humans on the whole are not very good at thinking about uncertainty. It takes us way outside human experience. Under any definition of human, it could take us right outside human experience. We could see 4 degrees centigrade we haven't seen for tens of millions of years on this planet. 4 degrees average global surface temperature above the second half of the 19th century, which we usually take as a benchmark. And of course, as Joe emphasized rightly, it's the sum total of all the emissions that matters. The physics has made this just about as difficult a public problem as it could, with lags and the uncertainty and the scale and the public good. But it's the lags that we focus on here, and you asked me to focus on. And we have to ask ourselves the question, how do we think about the effects of what we do on people down the track, 20, 30, 60, 100, more than 100 years down the track? And that's quite a hard problem. And Danny Kahneman and many others, behavioral economic psychology, have taught us that we're not very good at thinking through long-term consequences of our actions, even for ourselves, let alone for other people. I mean, smoking and drinking being obvious examples, but there are many more. So we have to ask ourselves and cross-examine ourselves, what should we do? And essentially, in economics, the idea of discounting is usually founded, discounting giving lower value to some benefit of a dollar that comes later than now. Discounting, we do it, or we argue we should do it, because future generations will be richer, and that's a bit like the other inequalities you're talking about. If they're going to be richer, then a dollar to them. You can argue, I think, and many people would go along with it, that it has lower value because it's to those to richer people. But there's another argument, which is very common in economics, is you discount because it's in the future. Now, it's that seems to me to have very little in the way of ethical foundation. I mean, imagine a life that starts 35 years from now and a pure time discount rate of 2%. And that's what a lot of people have actually, in our profession, to our discredit, in my view, have advocated. That would be saying that a life that starts 35 years from now has half the value of a life that starts now. I don't see any reason why we should take that kind of thing seriously. Because I'm assuming here it's discounting of lives. I'm assuming that person whose life starts 35 years from now has exactly the same consumption as now. I'm taking the growth of consumption bit out of it and just asking about pure time discounting. That's a very powerful assertion, and I haven't seen any serious argument in favour. If it's a question of the existence of that person, where that person may or may not exist, that's a separate question. And then the idea that they're half as likely to be there 35 years from now, this doesn't carry any sense. So I think in terms of the basic logic that we try to bring to bear, I don't see any reason, and I haven't heard any convincing argument, why you should discount lives in that kind of very powerful way. Now that's within the structure of standard economics and consequentialism. If you look at other approaches to moral philosophy, I mean, if you look at Kant and the categorical imperative not to treat other people as instruments, that seems to me to kick in strongly there too. If you look at Aristotelian ideas of what constitutes virtue, if you look at notions of rights of different people, the negative liberty in the language of Isaiah Berlin, not to be constrained by collective or governmental action or individual collective, the collection of individual actions. I think whichever way you look at it, and I started in the conventional economics way, but that shouldn't monopolize our attention. Whichever way you look at it, I don't see any powerful reason for doing that, bearing in mind that we're acting not only for ourselves, but on behalf of future generations.
Can I just try to re-emphasize what Nick said about how important this issue, what may sound like an arcane issue of the discount rate, as it's usually put. How do you discount the future? At a very practical level, I was involved in this issue when I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisor under President Clinton, because there are guidelines into how you evaluate different projects, how do you evaluate what should we do this or that. And at that time, the standard discount rate for valuing benefits in the future and risks in the future was around 7%. Now let me explain what that means. That 7% means that effectively something that you think is going to have an impact in 20 or 50 years, you say, we don't pay any attention to it. And we fought a very big battle, which we won, and said, in the case of climate change, this is a big deal, and that you can't use that kind of reasoning for exactly the kind of argument that Nick put forward, and we built in that a lower, that we wouldn't discount it. And let me also reemphasize the role of risk here. Because Nick pointed out that one of the arguments is that it was put forward is that in the future people are going to be richer, and because they're richer, why should we subsidize them to make their lives still richer by spending money today? Well, an inherent part of this problem is uncertainty. Not as much as a lot of people think, because I think we can be fairly sure that climate change is going to be big. The consequences are going to be very serious. Well, what does that mean? If it turns out that the consequences are anything near what we think they're going to be, then there are going to be very negative effects on our standard of living 50 years from now. And that means the value of saving $1 then is going to be very high. So we ought to spend a lot of money now to protect us against the future. We pay all the time, we pay insurance premiums. Why is that? Because we don't like risk. This can be viewed as a kind of insurance premium, and therefore it makes sense to do it. And we argued, actually, I was on the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. We actually argued maybe you ought to use a negative discount rate to take into account this kind of risk and this risk kind of the risk mitigation that is involved in trying to reduce the level of emissions.